Mortimer, said Sylvia suddenly, I think we will go back to town sometime soon.
I don't think you will ever go back to town, said Mortimer.
Fast asleep.
Welcome to Fast Asleep with Gina Marie, where we will either lull you to sleep or coddle you through some horrible chore with a captivating classic short story. Hi, everybody. I'm Gina. Marie is nearby, and Engineer Bob. Engineer Bob. You know what? I'm sure he is mansplaining something to some poor fool right now. He really should have his own podcast, you know, where he just mansplains how everything under the sun operates and why it's so important. Until we are all just fast asleep. Well, you've picked a good time to join us. We're already deep into the spooky season of Fast Asleep. Today's story, yes, it's spooky, and it is not unlike last week's story. It's shocking. It was written by H. Munro, a.k.a. Saki. If you haven't heard, you should really go back to episode number 340 on Fast Asleep for his Gabriel Ernest. That's the name of it. Unless you're just too squeamish about werewolves. So, here's a little more about the Scottish Hector Hugh Munro, who was surprisingly considered the master of the English short story. The master, and yet, like Charles Dickens, his style of fiction was not considered to be literature. Not in his time. It appeared in newspapers and really was so different from the style of the day. He was definitely the master of plot, of characterization, and of wry, dark humor. You just cannot finish a Saki story without a smile on your face or even an out-loud laugh. Okay, there is one very unfunny thing about Saki, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But first, he was actually born in British India in 1870, the son of an inspector general. He was educated there by governesses and had further schooling in England. He did go on to follow his father into serving for the Indian Imperial Police in Burma. Illness, though, forced him to return home to England after only a year. So, there he worked as a journalist for several newspapers. There he published his first short story in 1899, and he went on to produce several collections of short stories. Oh, always the cynic. Most of those stories played out the hypocrisies of the upper crust during the fading of the Victorian age. You know, animals were always a favorite subject for Saki, and you will note that today. But if you were a wealthy human in one of his stories, you were not going to make out well at all. Munro was also a playwright, and he wrote several novels. A few were historical. There was one in particular about the Russian Empire. No, I'm not going to be reading that one here, don't worry. Okay, I guess I need to get to that unfunny part. All right, here we are. Consider this. It was the start of the First World War, and despite being about 44 years old, financially well off, and remember previously qualified as an officer, Munro enlisted as an ordinary soldier. He was often very sick or badly injured, but he stayed on and on in that battlefield. It was November of 1916, and he sheltered in France in a crater when a German soldier, a German sniper, spotted the cigarette of a nearby soldier, and Hector Munro was the one who took the bullet and died. He was just 45 years old. And you know, there is no known grave for him. Today's story may actually disprove that theory we mentioned about readers smiling or laughing at Saki's endings. Well, I think so. Tell me what you think. Published in 1911. Tuck in, everybody, for H. Munro's The Music on the Hill. Sylvia Seltoun ate her breakfast in the morning room at Yezny with a pleasant sense of ultimate victory, such as a fervent Ironside might have permitted himself on the morrow of the Worcestershire fight. She was scarcely pugnacious by temperament, but belonged to that more successful class of fighters who are pugnacious by circumstance. Fate had willed that her life should be occupied with a series of small struggles, usually with the odds slightly against her, and usually she had just managed to come through, winning. And now she felt that she had brought her hardest and certainly her most important struggle to a successful issue. To have married Mortimer Seltoun, dead Mortimer, as his more intimate enemies called him, in the teeth of the cold hostility of his family, and in spite of his unaffected indifference to women. It was indeed an achievement that had needed some determination and adroitness to carry through. Yesterday, she had brought her victory to its concluding stage by wrenching her husband away from town and its group of satellite watering places and settling him down, in the vocabulary of her kind, in this remote, wood-girt manor farm, which was his country house. "Oh, you will never get Mortimer to go," his mother had said carpingly. "But if he once goes, he'll stay. Yezny throws almost as much a spell over him as town does. One can understand what holds him to town, but Yezny..." And the dowager had shrugged her shoulders. There was a somber, almost savage wildness about Yezny that was certainly not likely to appeal to town-bred tastes, and Sylvia, notwithstanding her name, was accustomed to nothing much more sylvan than leafy Kensington. She looked on the country as something excellent and wholesome in its way, which was apt to become troublesome if you encouraged it overmuch. Distrust of town life had been a new thing with her, born of her marriage with Mortimer, and she had watched with satisfaction the gradual fading of what she called the Jermyn Street look, a sophisticated maleness, in his eyes as the woods and heather of Yasny had closed in on them yesterday night. Oh, her willpower and strategy had prevailed. Mortimer, he would stay. Outside the morning room windows was a triangular slope of turf which the indulgent might call a lawn, and beyond its low hedge of neglected fuchsia bushes, a steeper slope of heather and bracken dropped down into cavernous combes overgrown with oak and yew. In its wild open savagery there seemed a stealthy linking of the joy of life with the terror of unseen things. Sylvia smiled complacently as she gazed with a school of art appreciation at the landscape. And then, of a sudden, she almost shuddered. "Well, it is very wild," she said to Mortimer, who had joined her. "One could almost think that in such a wild place the worship of Pan had never quite died out." "The worship of Pan never has died out," said Mortimer. "Other newer gods have drawn aside his votaries from time to time, but he is the nature god, to whom all must come back at last. He has been called the father of all the gods, but most of his children have been stillborn." Sylvia was religious in an honest, vaguely devotional kind of way, and did not like to hear her beliefs spoken of as mere aftergrowths, but it was at least something new and hopeful to hear dead Mortimer speak with such energy and conviction on any subject. "Well, you don't really believe in Pan?" she asked incredulously. "I've been a fool in most things," said Mortimer quietly, "but I'm not such a fool as not to believe in Pan when I'm down here. And if you're wise, you won't disbelieve in him too boastfully while you're in his country." It was not till a week later, when Sylvia had exhausted the attractions of the woodland walks round Yasny, that she ventured on a tour of inspection of the farm buildings. A farmyard suggested, in her mind, a scene of cheerful bustle with churns and flails and smiling dairy maids and teams of horses drinking knee-deep in duck-crowded ponds. As she wandered among the gaunt gray buildings of Yasny Manor Farm, her first impression was one of crushing stillness and desolation, as though she had happened on some lone, deserted homestead long given over to owls and cobwebs. Then came a sense of furtive, watchful hostility, the same shadow of unseen things that seemed to lurk in the wooded combes and coppices. From behind heavy doors and shuttered windows came the restless stamp of hoof or rasp of chain halter, and at times a muffled bellow from some stalled beast. From a distant corner, a shaggy dog watched her with intent, unfriendly eyes. As she drew near, it slipped quietly into its kennel, and slipped out again as noiselessly when she had passed by. A few hens, questing for food under a rick, stole away under a gate at her approach. Sylvia felt that if she had come across any human beings in this wilderness of barn and byre, they would have fled, wraith-like, from her gaze. At last, turning a corner quickly, she came upon a living thing that did not fly from her. Astretch in a pool of mud was an enormous sow, gigantic beyond the town woman's wildest computation of swine flesh, and speedily alert to resent and, if necessary, repel the unwanted intrusion. It was Sylvia's turn to make an unobtrusive retreat as she threaded her way past rickyards and cowsheds and long blank walls. She started, suddenly, at a strange sound. The echo of a boy's laughter, golden and equivocal. Jan, the only boy employed on the farm, a tow-headed, wizen-faced yokel, was visibly at work on a potato clearing halfway up the nearest hillside, and Mortimer, when questioned, knew of no other probable or possible begetter of the hidden mockery that had ambushed Sylvia's retreat. The memory of that untraceable echo was added to her other impressions of a furtive, sinister something that hung around Yesney. Of Mortimer, well, she saw very little. Farm and woods and trout streams seemed to swallow him up from dawn till dusk. Once, following the direction she had seen him take in the morning, she came to an open space in a nut copse, further shut in by huge yew trees, in the center of which stood a stone pedestal, surmounted by a small bronze figure of a youthful Pan. It was a beautiful piece of workmanship, but her attention was chiefly held by the fact that a newly cut bunch of grapes had been placed as an offering at its feet. Grapes were none too plentiful at the manor house, and Sylvia snatched the bunch angrily from the pedestal. Contemptuous annoyance dominated her thoughts as she strolled slowly homeward, and then gave way to a sharp feeling of something that was very near fright. Across a thick tangle of undergrowth, a boy's face was scowling at her, brown and beautiful, with unutterably evil eyes. It was a lonely pathway. All pathways round Yesney were lonely, for the matter of that, and she sped forward without waiting to give a closer scrutiny to this sudden apparition. It was not till she had reached the house that she discovered that she had dropped the bunch of grapes in her flight. "I saw a youth in the wood today," she told Mortimer that evening. "Brown-faced and rather handsome, but a scoundrel to look at. A gypsy lad, I suppose?"
"A reasonable theory," said Mortimer. "Only there aren't any gypsies in these parts at present."
"Well, then who was he?" asked Sylvia, and as Mortimer appeared to have no theory of his own, she passed on to recount her finding of the votive offering. "I suppose it was your doing," she observed. "It's a harmless piece of lunacy, but
People would think you dreadfully silly if they knew of it." "Did you meddle with it in any way?" asked Mortimer.
I threw the grapes away. It seemed so silly,"
said Sylvia, watching Mortimer's impassive face for a sign of annoyance. "I don't think you were wise to do that," he said, reflectively. "I've heard it said that the wood gods are rather horrible to those who molest them." Stay with me. I'll be right back.
I threw the grapes away. It seemed so silly,"
said Sylvia, watching Mortimer's impassive face for a sign of annoyance. "I don't think you were wise to do that," he said, reflectively. "I've heard it said that the wood gods are rather horrible to those who molest them."
"Horrible, perhaps, to those that believe in them, but you see, I don't," retorted Sylvia.
"All the same," said Mortimer, in his even, dispassionate tone, "I should avoid the woods and orchards if I were you, and give a wide berth to the horned beasts on the farm." It was all nonsense, of course, but in that lonely wood-girt spot, nonsense seemed able to rear a bastard brood of uneasiness.
"Mortimer,"
said Sylvia suddenly,
"I think we will go back to town sometime soon."
Her victory had not been so complete as she had supposed. It had carried her onto ground that she was already anxious to quit. "I don't think you will ever go back to town," said Mortimer. He seemed to be paraphrasing his mother's prediction as to himself. Sylvia noted with dissatisfaction and some contempt, self-contempt, that the course of her next afternoon's ramble took her instinctively clear of the network of woods. As to the horned cattle, Mortimer's warning was scarcely needed, for she had always regarded them as of doubtful neutrality at the best. Her imagination unsexed the most matronly dairy cows and turned them into bulls liable to see red at any moment. The ram, who fed in the narrow paddock below the orchards, she had adjudged, after ample and cautious probation, to be of docile temper. Today, however, she decided to leave his docility untested, for the usually tranquil beast was roaming with every sign of restlessness from corner to corner of his meadow. A low, fitful piping, as of some reedy flute, was coming from the depth of a neighboring copse, and there seemed to be some subtle connection between the animal's restless pacing and the wild music from the wood. Sylvia turned her steps in an upward direction and climbed the heather-clad slopes that stretched in rolling shoulders high above Yezny. She had left the piping notes behind her, but across the wooded coombs at her feet, the wind brought her another kind of music, the straining bay of hounds in full chase. Yezny was just on the outskirts of the Devon and Somerset country, and the hunted deer sometimes came that way. Sylvia could presently see a dark body breasting hill after hill and sinking again and again out of sight as he crossed the coombs, while behind him steadily swelled that relentless chorus, and she grew tense with the excited sympathy that one feels for any hunted thing in whose capture one is not directly interested. And at last he broke through the outermost line of oak scrub and fern and stood panting in the open, a fat September stag carrying a well-furnished head. His obvious course was to drop down to the brown pools of undercomb and thence make his way towards the red deer's favorite sanctuary, the sea. To Sylvia's surprise, however, he turned his head to the upland slope and came lumbering resolutely onward over the heather. "It will be dreadful," she thought. "The hounds will pull him down under my very eyes." But the music of the pack seemed to have died away for a moment, and in its place she heard again that wild piping, which rose now on this side, now on that, as though urging the failing stag to a final effort. Sylvia stood well aside from his path, half hidden in a thick growth of whortle bushes, and watched him swing stiffly upward, his flanks dark with sweat, the coarse hair on his neck showing light by contrast. The pipe music shrilled suddenly around her, seeming to come from the bushes at her very feet, and at the same moment the great beast slewed round and bore directly down upon her. In an instant her pity for the hunted animal was changed to wild terror at her own danger. The thick heather roots mocked her scrambling efforts at flight, and she looked frantically downward for a glimpse of oncoming hounds. The huge antler spikes were within a few yards of her, and in a flash of numbing fear she remembered Mortimer's warning to beware of the horned beasts on the farm. But then, with a quick throb of joy, she saw that she was not alone. A human figure stood a few paces aside, knee-deep in the whortle bushes. "Ah, drive it off!" she shrieked, but the figure made no answering movement. The antlers drove straight at her breast. The acrid smell of the hunted animal was in her nostrils, but her eyes were filled with horror of something she saw other than her oncoming death. And in her ears rang the echo of a boy's laughter, golden and equivocal. Introduction information for this episode is from an article entitled Saki by Simon Jenkins for the Royal Society of Literature, and other sources in our show notes. Music for this episode is The Last Dance from Cerno, Lullaby number 3 in E minor from Ron Rayton, and Shiver from Pablo Suarez. We hope you'll make a comment or two for us right here. You can always email us at fastasleepwithginamarie44@gmail.com. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. Thank you so much for taking the time to review and comment and like and subscribe. It makes a difference. And we, as always, thank you for listening. Keyword: well furnished. And next week, it's a ghost story from a classic author, new to Fast Asleep. Good night.